Some prisons are built to be inescapable. Walls too high, guards too ruthless, security too tight. But again and again, history has proven that no prison is truly escape-proof. From tunnels dug right under the enemy's nose to an entire glider built in secret, these 7 escapes were so insane they shouldn't have been possible. But they were. Stick around for number 1. It might just be the boldest prison escape ever pulled off. 1944, a Nazi prisoner of war camp. Guards were armed to the teeth, barbed wire stretched for miles, and watchtowers scanned for any sign of movement. For most prisoners, escaping was suicide. But for a group of Allied airmen, it was a challenge. Stalag Luft 3 wasn't just any POW camp. It was designed specifically to be escape-proof. The Germans had studied previous prison breaks and made sure their camp had loose, sandy soil that made tunnel digging nearly impossible. Microphones buried underground to detect any movement below the surface, and elevated barracks to prevent tunnels from being built in secret. The message was clear: you are trapped. But the prisoners had other plans. They didn't dig just 1 tunnel, they dug 3. Codenamed Tom, Dick, and Harry, these tunnels stretched over 300 feet, reinforced with bed slats, tin cans, and stolen floorboards. Air pumps were built from old Red Cross milk cans, and electrical wiring was stolen from Nazi supply rooms to light the way underground. It took over a year of painstaking work, but finally, on March 24, 1944, the escape began. One by one, men crawled through the tunnel, emerging just beyond the camp's perimeter fence. The original plan was to get 200 prisoners out. But then, disaster. The tunnel had come up a few feet short of the tree line. When the 77th man poked his head out, a German guard spotted the movement. The alarm sounded and chaos erupted. By morning, the manhunt was in full swing. Most of the escapees were recaptured within days. Soon after came Hitler's revenge. 50 men were lined up and shot, executed as a direct order from Hitler himself. Only 3 men made it to freedom. The Great Escape was one of the most daring prison breaks in history, but it came at a horrifying cost. And yet, it wouldn't be the last time POWs attempted the impossible. A medieval castle perched on a hilltop, surrounded by sheer cliffs and raging rivers. For the Nazis, Colditz was the ultimate POW prison. It wasn't just heavily guarded, it was built to be inescapable. But for the British officers trapped inside, Colditz was a challenge. The prisoners had tried everything, digging tunnels, disguising themselves, even hiding inside laundry carts. But as security tightened, they needed something bolder. They needed to fly. Their plan? Build a glider in an attic. Using stolen bed slats, floorboards, and bed sheets, they crafted a 2-person glider, piece by piece. It had wings, a tail, and a launch system built from a bathtub filled with concrete, all assembled in total secrecy. They called it the Colditz Cock. After months of work, the glider was finally ready. The plan was simple. The prisoners would break onto the roof of the castle. They would launch the glider off the attic, soaring over the river below. And then, freedom. But before they could make their move, the war ended. On April 16, 1945, American forces liberated Colditz Castle. The glider was never used, and yet, decades later, engineers built an exact replica of the Colditz Cock, and it worked. Had the prisoners launched their escape, there's a good chance they would have actually made it. But while Colditz prisoners never got the chance to fly to freedom, in another prison, far deadlier than this one, 2 men pulled off an escape that changed the world forever. Auschwitz, the deadliest concentration camp in history. For the 1.1 million people who entered its gates, escape was not an option. But in April 1944, 2 prisoners, Rudolf Verber and Alfred Wetzler, did the impossible. Their eyes had seen everything: the gas chambers, the crematoriums, the endless trains of Jewish families arriving, only to be murdered within hours. The world had no idea what was happening inside Auschwitz, but Verber and Wetzler knew they had to get out and tell the truth. Their escape plan was bold, simple, and absolutely terrifying. They didn't run or fight. They hid. They crawled beneath a woodpile just outside the camp's perimeter. They covered themselves in gasoline-soaked tobacco, masking their scent from Nazi tracking dogs. For 3 days, they lay motionless, If they moved, they died. On the fourth night, the guards stopped searching. They crawled from their hiding spot, slipped past the fences, and vanished into the darkness. For 2 weeks, they trekked through enemy territory, starving, exhausted, but unstoppable. Finally, they reached Slovakia, where they connected with resistance fighters and wrote down everything they had witnessed. It became known as the Werber-Wetzlar Report, the first detailed account of Auschwitz's gas chambers and mass executions. Their report was smuggled out to Allied force, and when it reached the US and Britain, it changed history. Mass deportations of Hungarian Jews were halted, saving thousands of lives. Werber and Wetzlar weren't just escapees, but witnesses to genocide, and the world finally listened. But Auschwitz wasn't the only death camp where prisoners refused to accept their fate. In another camp, an uprising exploded into chaos, and 300 prisoners fought back with their lives. Sobibor wasn't a prison, it was a factory of death. From 1942 to 1943, over 250,000 Jewish men, women, and children arrived here. Almost none ever left. But on October 14, 1943, a small group of prisoners fought back, and in the process, they burned an entire Nazi death camp to the ground. At Sobibor, prisoners were sent straight from the trains to the gas chambers. But a few were kept alive, forced to sort the stolen possessions of the dead, clean the camp, and dispose of the bodies. Among them were Leon Feldhendler, a Polish Jew, and Alexander Pechersky, a Soviet Jewish officer. They knew the truth. There was no survival here. Their only chance was to escape, or die trying. Their plan was simple, but deadly. They would kill the guards one by one, take their weapons, and when the moment was right, they would run. On the afternoon of October 14, 1943, they lured SS officers into storage rooms under the pretense of showing them valuables taken from Jewish prisoners. When the doors shut, each guard was stabbed or bludgeoned to death in silence. In less than an hour, 11 SS officers and several Ukrainian guards were dead. But then a guard stumbled upon one of the bodies. The alarm sounded and gunfire erupted. There was no time for strategy, only survival. Hundreds of prisoners sprinted for the fences, dodging bullets as they climbed over barbed wire and ran for the tree line. Some were gunned down instantly. Others stepped on landmines, tearing their bodies apart just inches from freedom. But against all odds, 300 prisoners made it out. For weeks, the Nazis hunted them down. Many were recaptured and executed, but around 50 survived, and their escape was the death sentence for Sobibor itself. Terrified that the uprising would inspire more revolts, the Nazis shut down the camp. They tore down the buildings, plowed over the gas chambers, and planted trees, trying to erase it from history. But history never forgets. Yet in another war, in another time, a group of Union soldiers pulled off the largest prison break of the American Civil War, escaping straight from enemy territory. During the American Civil War, prisons were death traps. Disease, starvation, and overcrowding killed as many men as bullets did on the battlefield. One of the worst was Libby Prison. Located in Richmond, Virginia, Libby Prison was meant for Union officers captured by the Confederates. But it was more like a rotting warehouse filled with suffering. The air was thick with the stench of disease. Food was nearly non-existent, and for most men, Libby was a slow death sentence. But for Colonel Thomas Rose, it was an obstacle to overcome. The plan was simple. They would tunnel out, right under the noses of their captors. Using nothing but knives, tin cans, and their bare hands, a small team of prisoners dug through a stone wall in the basement, carving out an opening just big enough for a man to squeeze through. Then came the real challenge, digging a tunnel that led outside the prison walls. Night after night, they worked in total darkness, using makeshift tools to carve through the dirt. The tunnel stretched over 50 feet, leading them to a nearby tobacco warehouse. It took them 17 days, each moment filled with the risk of being caught, beaten, or executed. Finally, on February 9th, 1864, the tunnel was ready. One by one, they crawled into the darkness. For hours, the escape continued. Men wriggled through the tunnel, emerging into the frigid night air, slipping away into enemy territory. By morning, 109 Union officers had vanished from Libby Prison, the largest escape of the Civil War. Confederate authorities were humiliated. A massive manhunt was launched, and while some of the escapees were recaptured, at least 59 made it back to Union lines. Free men once again. Libby Prison never recovered from the embarrassment. One of the most notorious prisons of the Civil War had been outwitted by sheer determination. But while these Union officers escaped through a tunnel in another prison, prisoners fought their way out with smuggled weapons, staging the largest jailbreak in British history. Mays Prison was supposed to be inescapable, a fortress of concrete and steel surrounded by armed guards and watchtowers. It held some of the most dangerous men in the UK, Irish Republican Army, IRA prisoners, convicted for bombings, assassinations, and armed attacks during the Troubles. But on September 25, 1983, 38 IRA prisoners did the impossible. They hijacked the prison from the inside and forced their way out in the largest jailbreak in British history. The plan was brutally simple. The prisoners had smuggled in handguns, waiting for the right moment to strike. When it came, they ambushed the guards, tied them up, and stole their uniforms. Disguised as officers, they took control of Block H7, locking staff inside cells before moving toward the main gate. Then came the final step, stealing a food delivery truck. Everything was going to plan, until a guard broke free and sounded the alarm. Sirens blared, floodlights lit up the yard, and real officers swarmed in. Gunfire erupted and chaos exploded as some prisoners scrambled into the hijacked truck, while others ran across the yard, dodging bullets. By the time the dust settled, 38 prisoners had vanished. A massive manhunt followed, and while 19 were eventually recaptured, others had disappeared into hiding. The UK had suffered one of its worst security failures, proving that no matter how secure a prison seems, there's always a way out. But while these men overpowered their guards, another group of inmates in Texas would take things even further, escaping and launching a crime spree that terrorized the country. Prison breaks are usually a desperate bid for freedom, no matter the cost. But in the year 2000, 7 inmates in Texas didn't just escape, they went on a rampage. These men were no ordinary prisoners. They were convicted murderers, robbers, and violent criminals, all serving long sentences at the John B. Connolly Unit, a maximum security prison in Texas. They had nothing to lose. On December 13, 2000, they made their move. They overpowered guards, took their weapons, and stole uniforms, making it impossible to tell who was a prisoner and who wasn't. Then, using a fake maintenance call, they lured more officers into an ambush, tying them up and locking them in a storage room. With control of the unit, they raided the armory, stealing guns, ammunition, and cash. Then, in a final brazen move, they hijacked a prison truck and drove straight out the front gate. By the time anyone realized what had happened, the Texas 7 were gone. For weeks, they stayed under the radar, robbing stores and stockpiling weapons. But their crime spree turned deadly on Christmas Eve. While robbing a sporting goods store, they shot and killed Officer Aubrey Hawkins, a police officer responding to the scene. Now, it wasn't just an escape, it was a nationwide manhunt. With their faces plastered across every news station in America, the Texas 7 split up, but it was too late. The FBI tracked them to a trailer park in Colorado. One member, Larry Harper, refused to be taken alive. He shot himself before he could be captured, and the remaining 6 were arrested. Justice was swift. Every surviving member was sentenced to death. The Texas 7 proved that some prison breaks don't end in freedom. They end in blood. And just like that, one of the most violent escapes in modern American history came to a close. But here's the question. Do you think you could have survived an escape from one of these prisons? Or would you have resigned yourself to your fate? Let us know in the comments. And don't forget to subscribe for more unbelievable stories from history.